the festival of Shavuos is swiftly upcoming, and there are many, many different angles, classic angles, to try to understand, unpack this festival. For example, one of the classic questions on the festival is the fact that if you look in the Torah, the various times that it talks about the festivals, it identifies the festival by name. It tells us why we have that festival. However, on Shavuot, the Torah dances around the fact that Shavuot is the anniversary of the Sinai experience. It tells us it's 50 days after Pesach, it's the beginning of the harvest. It kind of gives us all these other reasons as to why we are celebrating Shavuot on that particular day, even though when we do the math, we know exactly why. It's because it's the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. That's one angle that people like to look at. Of course, Shavuot also has a lot of different names. It's called Atzeret, it's called Shavuot, it's called Chag HaBikurim. And each one of these names, of course, identify a different aspect of this particular festival. Now, last year in our Shavuos primer, we discussed many of these questions, and we can link it in the podcast show notes. What I want to do today is I want to focus on the many different customs that we have on this day. This is a very unique festival in that it has no mitzvahs. Every other festival in the Torah has a mitzvah associated with it. So, of course, on Pesach, there's loads of mitzvahs. You got to eat the Pesach offering. You have to eat matzah. You cannot eat chametz. Many laws governing what we have to do on Pesach. Of course, on Rosh Hashanah, we got to blow the shofar. On Yom Kippur, we have to fast, and then we have to suffer in 5 different ways. Sukkot, of course, we sit in the sukkah. We shake the lulav and shake the esrog, and then we have this one festival that there's no mitzvos that are tethered to this particular festival holiday. Yet, there are many different customs that we still do today. So what I want to do today is to go through quickly some of the customs and to try to examine and explore them and hopefully make them more meaningful, make our observance of the festival that's upcoming more meaningful. So, of course, Shavuos is the anniversary of the giving of the Torah, and therefore it's going to be associated with the study of Torah. And since time immemorial, there has been a custom for the Jewish people on the first night of Shavuot to study Torah the entire night, and then in the morning, which heralds the time when the actual Ten Commandments, the revelation happened, then to kind of experience the morning coming on the heels of studying Torah the night before. And the Midrash tells us that during the original Sinai experience, the Jewish people were a little tired, and they fell asleep. And the Almighty had to awaken them from their slumber, and therefore, as a way to rectify that on the original Shavuot, we had to be woken up to the Ten Commandments. We're going to make sure that we're going to step the whole night. We're not going to be woken up at all. We're going to study Torah the whole night, and therefore, when we have the Ten Commandments in the morning, we're not going to need to be woken up. Now, the origin of this custom is already found in the Zohar. Again, that's attributed to Reb Shimon Yochai. We're talking about 2,000 years ago. However, today, modern times, it has become exceedingly popular. And one of the reasons for that is a famous letter that was authored by Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz. He was one of the great Kabbalists in 16th century Tzfat. And he wrote a letter that is published in one of the great books of the post-medieval scholarship era called the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the Shalach. And this is an amazing letter that really inspires us to study Torah this night. And I want to read this letter. It's a very long letter, but we'll go through it quickly because it's a very powerful insight, a very powerful inspiration for us as to the tremendous auspicious time of the night of Shavuot. So again, we're talking about the mid-1500s in Tzfat. Some of the greatest sages in Jewish history are there. This is the time when the Arizal's there. The Arizal actually comes at 1570, but around that same era. Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, of course, one of the most important figures in Jewish history, he's there. We have the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz. Some of the great sages and heroes of the time are all coalesced in a small little hamlet in northern Israel. So this is the letter written by Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz. He says, you should know that together with Rabbi Yosef Karo, we decided to study Torah the night of Shavuot and to make sure we're not going to sleep at all. And you know what? We were successful that night. We studied Torah without even stopping for a second. And then he says we developed a particular study regimen. It goes through what they did. They read scripture, and then they went to Mishnah, and they went to various other parts of the Kabbalah, and various parts of the Tanakh, and the Psalms. It's saying the exact regimen of what they did. And then when we started studying the Mishnah, the Almighty merited us, and suddenly we had a revelation. And a voice of an angel started speaking to us from the mouth of Rabbi Yosef Karo. And it spoke very loudly and with clear enunciation. And even the neighbors heard it, and they didn't understand it. But it was so beautiful and so pleasant and so strong. And we were so wowed by it, we fell on our face, and no one was even able to look at Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was now being seized by this angel. I want to point out that if I read that, I'd be like, oh, okay, fine. I know where this is going. I've spoken to people who have taken hallucinogenic mushrooms in the past. Like, okay. There's a tendency to be very cynical about what we're about to read. But it's important to remember that Rabbi Yosef Karo and his colleagues there, these are some of the most reputable people in history. Again, you look at his books, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, accepted universally as the authoritative text of halacha. His works on halacha are gargantuan and totally devoid, so to speak, of mysticism. Not totally devoid, but it's the most rigorous, comprehensive take on halacha. One of the greatest sages of all time. And here we see a totally different angle of his persona. We see angels giving them a visitation on the night of Shavuot. Moreover, we have part of the text of what the angel said. He tells him, this is the angel talking, listen, my beloved friends, you should have peace. You are praiseworthy. Your children are praiseworthy. You're praiseworthy in this world. You're praiseworthy in the next world. And the angel's talking as if the angel is the Torah and the Mishnah. And it's saying, I have been neglected. I've been thrown in the ground. The splendor and the honor and the glory of the Torah has been abandoned. But now you have restored the glory to its previous prominence. And it's describing how the sound of your Torah and the utterance of your lips is like in front of God, and all the angels are quiet, and all the seraphim, different kinds of angels, are totally silent, and the various angels and all the heavenly spheres are all looking down and looking what y'all are doing. And again, he goes on and on about the praiseworthiness of what y'all are doing, and then he encourages them, be strong, love the Almighty's Torah. If you could figure out, if you can imagine even 1/1,000,000th of the pain that I have, that the Torah has, when it is neglected, you would never laugh the rest of your life. And then he encourages them to say various prayers. Don't stop for a single second studying Torah. Stand on your feet and say as if it was Yom Kippur, and right away everyone's just following what they did. And then he continues, to encourage them and to strengthen them and to inspire them, and then he departs, and the angel departs. And in this text, he testifies. He's like, I'm telling you just like one little bit. I'm telling you like 1% of what actually happened, because I can't say what actually happened. But this is just an amazing documentation that has, by the way, been proven, so to speak, by contemporaneous sources. So this is not something that was made up, hagiographically post facto. And then it goes on to say how they burst into tears, and they committed themselves, and they accepted a bunch of vows. And the next day they went and they told all their friends, and everyone started crying. I can't believe we missed it. And the second night it happened again. And this time they had a minyan. They had 10 people that were there studying Torah. And again, the voice of this angel appeared, and they committed themselves further. And again, this is a very, very long essay. It was translated. You can read it online. And this particular story and the exact text, so to speak, of what they said became part of a common regiment that was done, that's still done today, where people try to reenact, so to speak, the exact prayers and study of the people in Tzfat. Until this day, you can buy a book called Tikkun Leil Shavuot, which is it's translated as the order of what we study on Shavuot, and this is a reenactment, so to speak, of what they did at that time. So this is, again, when people read this, they're like, oh my goodness, this night has special powers. This is the night of Torah. And if we commit ourselves to studying Torah this night without any interruption and without stopping for even a second, we could unlock great powers. I don't imagine we'll have visitations from angels, but if we're ever going to have visitations, this is the night to do it. And the Arizal, of course, he's contemporaneous to them. He declared, whoever does not sleep this night at all, doesn't even doze off, and studies Torah this night, I will guarantee that at least that year, he's going to live out that year. He's not going to die that year. And no bad things will happen to him. Just an amazing insight that there's power that's unlocked with the study of Torah of that night. Now, this year, we're not sure exactly how we're going to do it. Every year, of course, the shuls are open and they have barbecues like at 3 a.m. to keep people excited. And there's, of course, a series of lectures. Some people study by themselves. Some people study that if there's a lecture. Our shul, one of our shuls in the neighborhood, has a very hostile neighbor. And the neighbor is very upset because this particular shul is done in a house. And this neighbor is very upset that there is a synagogue next door. So he's always trying to get the HOA, the homeowner association, to try to ban and disband the synagogue. So he's always videotaping to make, to get evidence. And he started a lawsuit against us. And the HOA said, okay, we're going to file this lawsuit, even though it's unconstitutional to try to stop a house of worship from operating. We're going to do it anyhow to pacify this neighbor. And then, what do Jews do when there is a lawsuit against a synagogue? You have the best lawyers in the world say, okay, I'm working pro bono. I'm working for free. So the synagogue sent a message to the HOA that we're willing to go through thousands of hours of free pro bono legal counseling, and we will exhaust all your funds, and you still won't win. So then the HOA dropped the lawsuit. But then what happened is, of course, there was the coronavirus. So one of the ways that the synagogue tried to mitigate the risk, of course, there were a bunch of weeks that everyone was closed. But one of the ways to try to mitigate the risk, both at the initial beginning of the epidemic and after things started reopening, they would have the prayers outside. And they would have the backyard. They would go to the backyard and they would go outside. But the neighbor, of course, is not happy about that. So every time there's prayers now outside, he takes his boombox and plays blaring music to try to disrupt the prayers. I remember, yesterday I told my son, I said, see this? This is when the Torah talks about a rasha, a wicked person. This is the example. We're trying to pray to God, and he is deliberately, maliciously trying to just disrupt it with no gain in his own. Doesn't want to listen to music. Just wants to spite us. Anyhow, just terrible. And by the way, this week he got new speakers. I think he went to the store because the previous speakers were not loud enough. So he got new speakers and just blaring it the entire prayer, the entire duration of the prayer. Well, at least we're glad that he's entertained. But anyhow, how exactly are we going to have the prayer, the study this year? Are we going to do it outside with lights? Or is there going to be lectures, but no studying with partners? Who knows? But like every year, there's going to be people studying Torah the whole night, both locally and all over the world. And this became a widespread custom, ubiquitous custom amongst the Jewish people. Now, one of the questions people ask about this custom is that if you actually do the math, there is a better way to study. And here's why. What happens before Shavuot? If you're going to stay up the whole night, you got to take a nap the day before. So you take a nice, long, healthy nap the day before. And then at night, you have to have the meal. You have to have the festive meal of the festival. So you have the meal. By the time that you get to go study, it's close to midnight. And then you only study for 3, 4, 5 hours, and it's already time to pray Shabbos. And then you get home, you're exhausted, you sleep the whole day. And then you take another nap, and then the rest of the festival, you're just sleeping to make up for the night that you missed. Wouldn't it be better for us to study Torah before Shavuot? Study a little bit maybe after the meal. But then wake up early, study early, and then be able to pray like a mensch, as they say, and then be able to study the whole afternoon. In the end, if you just behave normally, you'll be able to study a lot more. Why is there this custom that torpedoes all the prayers, and it's, my wife says that you're sleeping. You're just sleeping for like a week afterwards. You're just trying to catch up. Is it really worth it? Is it really worth it to stay up the whole night? That's the question that they asked. So I heard an answer. I think it's a very valuable insight. If you think about it, Shavuot is the day that we had the Ten Commandments. But how exactly it's the day of the receiving of the Torah, it's a great mystery. We got mitzvahs beforehand, and the bulk of the mitzvahs we got afterwards. So it's not the first. It's not all of Torah. We didn't get the tablets until 40 days later. Even then, those tablets were broken. And Moshe didn't really give us the actual Torah until he came down the third time on Yom Kippur. So maybe Yom Kippur should be the day that we got the Torah, because that's when we actually started getting the actual bulk of the Torah. It's a good question. And maybe the answer is yes, Yom Kippur is the day of receiving the Torah. In fact, what do we do in Yom Kippur? We commit ourselves. Everything right there? What do we do in Yom Kippur? We commit ourselves to uphold all of Torah. So in a certain sense, Yom Kippur is a day of receiving the Torah. But there's a difference. The love of Torah, the obsession, the infatuation with Torah, that the relationship between people with Torah, that was forged on Shavuot. Of course, we didn't get the Torah till later. And of course, the actual laws, the application of the law, the doing of the Torah, so to speak, that happened later. It happened even earlier. A little bit happened on Shavuot, but that's not what Shavuot is special for. Shavuot is special for the fact that when the Jewish people, Torah and Torah study is our pastime. And therefore, we love studying Torah. We're obsessed with studying Torah, and we're even willing to do crazy things like staying up the entire night and studying. And that's the idea. The idea is that there's a relationship that we have with Torah. There's an obsession that we have with Torah that our nation has forged, and that is what we got at Sinai. We saw the grandeur of Torah. We had this experience that even the angels can experience. And that developed a relationship that goes on until this day. We're more than 3,300 years from the original Sinai, but every year we're trying to relive that. And the staying up at night, you're bleary-eyed, you can't even concentrate. But you know what? You're acting like a crazed person because you are a crazed person. With respect to Torah, our nation has an obsession with Torah, and the fire of that relationship endures. Every Shavuot, we relive it with studying Torah the entire night. Now, one of the other things that we do on Shavuot is we read the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is one of the 5 books of scripture that are called a Megillah, meaning a scroll. And they are read at various junctures throughout the year. Of course, the book of Esther, which tells the story of Purim, we read on Purim. That makes a lot of sense. The Song of Psalms is read on Pesach. The book of Koheles, the book of Ecclesiastes, is read appropriately, of course, on Sukkot. And of course, the sad book, the book of Lamentations, the book that details the Jewish people at their nadir, is read on Tisha B'Av, on the day that the temples were both destroyed, the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. The book of Ruth is read on Shavuot, and it's not immediately clear what the connection between Shavuot is and the story of Ruth. Now, Ruth, who is Ruth? So the story of the book of Ruth begins with a family, a rich family from Bethlehem, a Jewish family, that there was a famine in the land, and they were so rich, and they didn't want people driving them crazy. So they left Israel, left the land of Israel, and moved to Moab. This is a family of 4. The father and the mother, Elimelech and Naomi, and their 2 sons, Machlon and Chilion. They get to Moab, and they almost are abandoning their people, departing their people, and their 2 sons end up marrying 2 princesses from Moab. But things go really poorly. They lose all their money. The father dies, Elimelech dies, the 2 sons die, and all you have now is the mother, Naomi, and her 2 daughters-in-law, and their fortunes have soured, and they want to head back to Israel. And the mother-in-law tells the 2 daughters-in-law, "Okay, I'm going back. You guys stay here. You guys are Moabites. You can stay here." And they say, "No, we're coming with you." And she tells them, "Well, you don't expect me. I'm not having any more children. I don't have any more money. What do you want from me?" And after that argument was posed, the first daughter says, "Okay, you're right. I'm heading back." And she heads back, and she right away goes back to her Moabite ways. But Ruth, the second daughter-in-law, she persists. She says, "I'm committed to you. I'm committed to the Jewish people. I'm coming back. I'm joining the fraternity." And indeed she does. But they are penniless, and they return to Israel, and they have one hope. They have one relative who's somewhat wealthy, and that's Boaz. And Boaz's wife has passed, and there really is no way for them to strike up a relationship with Boaz. And eventually, Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth, they're so destitute, they're so poor that they have to go beg and pick up the leftover shearings from the field. And Ruth goes to the field of Boaz. Boaz is a wealthy landowner, and she picks up the leftover drops of grain. The halacha is, the Torah tells us that when you gather a bunch of grain, a little bit drops off, you leave it for the poor people. They're so poor, and they end up, Ruth is sent by her mother-in-law to go pick up little scraps of leftover grain from Boaz's field. Now, there is a law in the Torah, Levirate marriage laws it's called, with the law of Yibum, that when a husband dies without any children, then one of the relatives of the deceased husband should marry the wife of his relative, and therefore to create a legacy for the departed husband. We know that applies today. That law really applies to sons only. But if you remember in the book of Genesis, we have a story with Judah and Tamar. Tamar is Judah's daughter-in-law. She marries one of his sons, Er. He dies. She marries the next one, Onan. He dies without any children. And then Judah, unwittingly, unknowingly, he ends up marrying his daughter-in-law, or at least spending some time with her, and thus fathering twins with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And that becomes like a fulfillment of this idea that the relative of the deceased husband who doesn't have any children marries the widow and has children and creates a legacy for the dead husband. So here we have Ruth, and she used to be married to Machlon, and now they die without any children. So now we're looking for a relative to marry, and Boaz ends up being that relative, and he spends again one night with Ruth, and then he right away dies, but she becomes pregnant. It's a very similar story to the Judah and Tamar, and that alliance, so to speak, that unity, that union, and Ruth and Boaz. And both of them are very important stories because they're along the same line, and they are the forebearers of King David and the forebearers of the Messiah. So the story ends that Ruth has a son, and that son, Oved, goes on to have a son whose name is Yishai, Jesse. And Jesse, of course, is the father of King David. That's how the book ends, attributing the lineage of King David all the way back to Judah, where Judah has a son with his daughter-in-law Tamar, again under somewhat scandalous circumstances, and then it goes on all the way through until David is born, and that is the story of Ruth that we read every Shavuot. What exactly the connection between this story, the book of Ruth, and Shavuot? It's a great mystery, and we'll try to answer that question. So one of the classic ideas given is that, well, King David was born on Shavuot. So there's a connection between King David, the monarchy, the Messiah, and Shavuot, and therefore we're telling his backstory, so to speak, on Shavuot. Well, the question is, okay, if we want to talk about King David on Shavuot, there's a lot better books in the scripture to talk about. Of course, you read the book of Samuel, and the large part of the book of Samuel is dedicated to telling the story of King David. And of course, a little bit of the book of Kings. The book of Psalms is primarily authored by King David. There is no shortage of good scripture discussing King David. Why do we need to go to the book of Ruth that tells of his pedigree and the unusual circumstances of his great-grandmother? So I want to suggest an answer to that question. And that will show us maybe a deeper connection between this story and Shavuot. When King David was nominated to be king, or even beforehand, when King David goes out to fight Goliath, there's this monster enemy, this giant, and no one could topple him. And King David, short little guy with a slingshot, is willing to take him on. In appreciation of David's bravery, Saul says, okay, I want you to wear my clothing, the clothing of the king, when you go engage in war with Goliath. And as Saul is witnessing what happens here, he notices something very unusual. Saul was the tallest Jew. He was the tallest man amongst the nation. And somehow his clothing fits perfectly snugly on David. And Saul sees that and he realizes that David fits in really nicely with being kingly, with royalty. So Saul starts investigating who exactly is this little Gingy, who's this redhead, who is he? He seems like he is fit for kingdom, for being a king. And his advisors say he's not fit for being a king. In fact, his pedigree is dubious. We're not even sure if he's allowed to marry amongst the Jewish people. The reason for that is because the Torah says that an Ammonite and a Moabite convert is not allowed to marry amongst the Jewish people. They can become Jewish, they could convert, but once they convert, they can't marry a Jew. Do you know why? Because when the Jewish people encounter the Ammonite and Moabite, their cousins essentially from family of Lot, when they encountered them, they didn't bring them food and water. And therefore, there's something corrupt, there's something unkind about these nations, and therefore we don't want them part of the Jewish people. It's prohibitive for them to marry Jews. They can become Jewish, but they can't intermarry with the Jewish people. And who is King David's great-grandmother? It's a Moabite convert, Ruth. And therefore, she wasn't allowed to marry the Jewish people. And that continues. Her son and her grandson, and of course her great-grandson, David is not allowed to marry amongst the Jewish people. And therefore, not only can't be a king, he can't even marry amongst the Jewish people. That was the argument. And they responded to them. There's a whole debate here happening. Is that so? Not necessarily. Because if you read the words critically, Lo yavo Ammoni umoavi perkahal Hashem, a male Ammonite convert and a male Moabite convert cannot join the Jewish people. But maybe a female Ammonite convert and a female Moabite convert can join the Jewish people. And Ruth, of course, is a female, and she's a convert from the Moabites. And therefore, maybe David is qualified to be amongst the Jewish people. But there's a whole debate. And some argue on this side, and some argue on that side. Until one of the spectators, participants of this debate, says, well, I have a tradition going back from Samuel, who, by the way, was alive at the time. Samuel said quite clearly that female Moabite converts are allowed to join the Jewish people. And the question is, well, does that apply by other nations? We don't say by other nations. The Egyptian converts, they're given a 3-year grace period, or 3-generation grace period, and then they can join the Jewish people. But that applies universally, both male and female. We don't make this exception. And the answer, says the Talmud, why are the Moabite and Ammonite female princes disincluded from the restriction of marrying amongst the Jewish people? Because it gives us the reason why they were originally not included, because they didn't approach the Jewish people with food and water. Well, who is supposed to approach? Who's supposed to go out and reach out and approach other people? It's the men. The women, they're not supposed to be the ones who are on the vanguard. And consequently, the women are not included in the misdeed, so to speak, that led to the ban, and therefore they're not included in the ban either. That's what the Talmud says. But it's interesting. King David, of course, the prototypical king of the Jewish people, he is someone who has very questionable lineage. His Achilles heel is the fact that there was a legitimate discussion whether he's even allowed to marry amongst the Jewish people. And, of course, this book is going to bolster his credentials. This book is written by Samuel. But it's interesting. There's a very interesting transformation that happens here. David, initially, or at least in the belief, in the eyes of some, is so disqualified from being king that he's not even allowed to marry amongst the Jewish people. Yet, ultimately, via this book, David is transformed from being a pariah, from being ostracized from the Jewish people, from even the Jewish community, into being a king. And that is exactly what happens with Torah. The Talmud tells us that if you have a high priest who is ignorant in Torah matters, and you have a mamzer, a bastard, who's a great Torah scholar, which one of them deserves more reward? Says the Talmud. A high priest, the holiest person in the world, walks into the Holy of Holies, but still does not deserve as much honor as a mamzer, as a bastard who cannot marry amongst the Jewish people, who's a Torah scholar. Torah is the ultimate equalizer. It gives people the opportunity to forge their own identity, their own path in life. Even someone who is on the lowest social strata of the Jewish people, their moms, their bastard can't marry amongst the Jewish people. With Torah, they can have the same transformation that David had in the book of Ruth. That's one idea as to how the themes of the book relate to the festival. In addition, Sinai, that experience historically was akin to a grand conversion experience. The Jewish people, of course, they're descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they weren't formally forged into the Jewish nation until Sinai happened. And the Sinai experience is the equivalent of being a mass conversion event, and therefore the greatest, female convert heroine of the Jewish people is highlighted on this day. Another answer is that Ruth really embodies the message of Torah. For someone to really absorb Torah, for someone to really embrace Torah, they're going to have to forfeit something. Whether that is creature comforts, whether that is standing amongst society, whatever it is, someone's going to have to forfeit something in order to accept Torah. And we see someone here. Ruth, she joined this family, but then she lost her husband, she lost her father-in-law, they lost all their money. And she could have very easily said, I'm going back to my Moabite princess ways, and I can live a lavish life with a life of wealth, a life of plenty. But she made the determination. She had the strength of character to decide, I'd rather live a life of Torah with the Jewish people, even if it means forfeiting all the wealth and all the goodness and all the creature comforts of being a princess. And that, of course, is the great model for us. That's the great hero, the heroine of Shavuot is Ruth, because she shows us how far someone can go to give up, to forfeit great things in favor of Torah. And finally, there is a ubiquitous custom to consume dairy foods on Shavuot. Now, of course, every festival we're supposed to celebrate. And in fact, on Shavuot, we're supposed to celebrate even more than usual. And what does it mean to celebrate? So the Talmud, you can only celebrate if you're having meat and wine. The Talmud was not a fan of the vegan lifestyle, apparently. Or maybe it was, but there's a certain element of celebration that you can only have with meat and wine. Yet, there is a custom that became very widespread for some reason to have also a little bit of dairy on Shavuot. And everyone's trying to figure out why. So the classic answer given is the Jewish people at Sinai, well, they had to start keeping Torah. They converted, right? Overnight, you convert, and suddenly you're Jewish, and you have all these laws. Well, how do you eat meat? You have to slaughter an animal. Well, how do you slaughter an animal? You have to have a sharp knife. You have to know all these laws. Okay, well, where's Moshe? Moshe's up in heaven. Moshe's not there to teach us how to slaughter an animal. So they had to temporarily withhold from eating meat before they knew how to process the meat in a kosher fashion until Moshe came back down, and therefore we relive that by a little bit, to a certain degree, withholding from meat to remember what the Jewish people had to go through in order to eat in a kosher fashion now that they're starting to keep the Torah. There's some other interesting answers given as to why we eat milk, dairy products on Shavuot. One idea is that, when there's a small baby, the first couple of months of their life, they are sustained solely with milk, mother's milk. And this is to indicate to us that the power of Torah is a multivitamin. Mitzvahs, every mitzvah corresponds to one part of the body. But there's one mitzvah that covers everything. That's the panacea. And that is Torah. Just as milk infuses life to every part of the baby's life, to the entirety of the baby's body, so too Torah infuses life to every part of our soul. Another answer as to why we eat milk, and we eat dairy on Shavuot. This is an idea I saw last year. I thought it was very cool. If you do the math, when was Moshe born? We know Moshe was born on the 7th day of Adar. Well, for the first 3 months of Moshe's life, he was being hidden by his mother. And then afterwards, she had to put him she had to hide him, essentially. So she put him into a box and let the box float on the Nile. If you do the math, 3 months after Moshe's birthday is the exact anniversary of the Sinai experience. It's almost like the lowest point of Moshe's life. He's abandoned by his family, put in a box and allowed to float in the water. That same day, 80 years later, is when Moshe reached the absolute pinnacle of a human experience, where he is having prophecy with God in front of the entire nation on Mount Sinai. But moreover, what happened that day? Who comes and finds the box? It's Pharaoh's daughter. And she takes this baby and she adopts the baby. She calls him Moshe. But then she tries to find a wet nurse to feed the baby. And Moshe refuses to suckle from an Egyptian wet nurse. And what the Talmud tells us is that Moshe, I guess on some spiritual level, knew that his mouth is going to eventually be talking to God. And therefore, it's improper to feed this mouth a non-kosher food that gets filtered through the Egyptian woman and gets into her milk, and therefore he just refused. So what happened that day? That same day, Miriam, Moshe's older sister, she intervenes and she says, wait a minute, I know someone who could be a good wet nurse for this adopted baby of yours. There's this Jewish woman, Yocheved, of course we know is the biological mother of Moshe. She'll be the nurse. And in this interesting turn of events, Moshe is adopted by the Egyptians, but he's actually raised by his biological mother, who is acting as a wet nurse, even though she's actually the biological mother of Moshe. And what day does that happen? That happens on Shavuot. So there's a miracle that happens to the Jewish people with respect to milk on this day, and we again memorialize that with eating dairy. This year, I saw a new answer, and this really interesting idea. The Talmud tells us that the origin of milk, of mother's milk, is blood. It used to be blood, it gets turned into milk. Okay. But we know that blood is non-kosher. So every shred, according to the Talmud, that all the milk comes from blood, it tells us that the milk used to be blood, but it was cleansed, and there's no shred of the non-kosher blood in the milk. Similarly, Torah can take us from being non-kosher, from being corrupted, from being like blood, non-consumable for Jews. And it could transform us into milk. It can make us holy. It can elevate us. It can cleanse us. It could purge us of any of our misdeeds. These are some of the customs that we do. Of course, we don't have any mitzvos like other festivals. But we have the one mitzvah that's the granddaddy of them all. Of course, the mitzvah of studying Torah. We have the panacea. We have the multivitamin. And we spend the whole night studying Torah. And then in the morning, we read about Ruth. And we recognize that her story, elements of her story, really help us have a much more meaningful day of accepting the Torah, a more meaningful Shavuot. And then we get home, you have some dairy. Whether the dairy is just a cup of coffee, whether it's some cheesecake, it's blintzes, whatever it is, you enjoy that, and maybe you remember some of the reasons why we have this very unusual custom. And my hope and my blessing is to all that we have a wonderful, fascinating, fabulous, inspiring, uplifting Shavuot. We again renew our vows with God and His Torah. Shavuot is compared to a wedding date. The Jewish people are like wedded to Torah. And every year we renew our vows. And it should be the most inspiring Shavuot on memory. And we'll accept the Torah with joy. with eagerness, with passion, and as a result of that, we'll have an amazing year of Torah study together, studying Torah, connecting to the Almighty, connecting to our Jewish brethren via the Almighty's holy Torah. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Look forward to hearing any questions, comments, or feedback of any type.